Martin J. Cowling, welcome to Priceless Advice with Leaders of Volunteers. And where are you beaming from today for this interview?
Dana, it's great to join you, and it's been a long time, I think, since we've had a conversation like this, if we've ever done it. So thank you for having me on your segment. And I just want to pay tribute to the work you've done with these series. It's been absolutely stimulating and enjoyable for people from across the globe, and you would be surprised at where your audience is coming from. Today, I am in Thailand, which is actually where I am located during COVID season. As my flying wings have been slightly curtailed, and you'll get a bit of a background of the Bangkok landscape just behind me there. You'll see just behind me there is our local temple and our local market, where a lot of the action goes on in this city.
That's gorgeous. I'm really excited. It's 14 hours ahead, so it's about 7 o'clock my time and 9-ish a.m. Thai time, Bangkok time for you, although I'm sure there's other time zones within the country as well. But thank you for taking the time to do this. We've had a couple of other shorter chats and things, and we've stayed connected on social media, but I don't believe we've seen each other in person since the Points of Light in perhaps Chicago. When did you?
I'm trying not to think when the last time was. It's about 8 years. I went to every Points of Light conference in the late 90s, 2000s. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking Chicago or Philadelphia would have been the last one I saw you at.
Probably. I know that we hung out in Chicago, and I'm trying to come up with like a karaoke or dinner memory in Philadelphia, and I'm drawing a blank, which could be good or bad, but I'm going to say Chicago.
I'm always well behaved, you know that.
I do know that you're always well behaved, and you're a wonderful going out to dinner with colleagues after the conference.
That's very kind.
So, Martin, part of our chats on social media and more informal chats leading up to it has been a lot around not just pandemic times, but in general, what are some of the next steps in volunteering? And you've got a wonderful global perspective, not just because of where you are now, but throughout your career. You've very well traveled. I know other global consultants like Rob Jackson is trying to catch up with your level of miles of travel, and he's might be catching up. I don't know. The longer you're in one place, maybe he does. But what do you see as a near future of the next, maybe 6 months versus the next 5 or 6 years for our sector, for our profession?
I see 3 mega trends impacting on us, and the first is a massive political divide that I have never seen in my life before. And wherever you are in the world, the right and the left are polarizing in ways that I have never seen, whether it's in Thailand or the United States or the UK. And we are definitely moving into a place where we see other people as the other, capital T, capital O. And people are not just hunkering down this COVID time, but they're actually hunkering down into their own communities more than I've ever seen before. So people are hanging out a lot less with people who are different to them and their social groups. And volunteering has traditionally been one of the ways that we've been able to breach those gaps. So, for example, in most of my programs, I've had people from different cultural and linguistically different backgrounds. I've people who have been gay or lesbian or straight, atheist or Christian, Jewish, Muslim. I've seen all of those people mixing together. And my concern is that we are starting to see a polarization in volunteering, where people are saying, I don't fit in with this group, so I'm going to disconnect from volunteering with that group. And I'm seeing language, and both subtle and direct, that makes it harder to engage. Let me give you an example of this. Volunteering in Australia is largely a middle-class activity. Working class organise, so they'll do informal volunteering. The upper class tend to pay for the volunteering, and the middle class do it.
Yeah.
And the challenge for us is that if you're somebody who doesn't feel you fit in with the middle class, it's very hard to engage with volunteering. And there's been numerous studies that have come out of the Australian context and the UK context that show the language we use, the decisions we make, impact on that. So, for example, I worked for an organisation where there was a great deal of fuss made about the fact that we could give volunteers car park spaces. Now, the people who didn't actually own a car couldn't actually get to the place they were volunteering at by public transit.
Yeah.
So we actually immediately, we were like, oh, we've got these great car parking spots. You can just park here. And all the people who said, actually can't afford a car. Yeah. It takes me 3 buses and $10 to get to your door, were immediately excluded. Right. So it's those subtle things that we engage with. And I'm seeing that move from subtlety to blatant. And so the scary thing is I'm not seeing people bridge those divides now. Mm-hmm. And I am wondering where volunteering sits in trying to mend the deep fissures we're seeing in society. Because I know when I get people mixing together on a project, it's amazing what people learn from each other. And it's amazing the stories that people can actually share with each other. And we need to find ways of getting volunteering to re-engage with that. The second trend that I'm seeing at the moment is directly linked to COVID. And it comes back to one of my old hobby horses, which is the importance of volunteering in our culture. So across the world, whether it was Israel or the UK or the USA or Japan or Singapore, many organizations that put their hands on their heart, and say, volunteering is really important to us, said to all their volunteers, you stood down.
Right, yeah.
And in fact, in some cases, didn't even tell their volunteers they were stood down. There was one situation someone was telling me about yesterday. They turned up to their charity shop to do their sorting, and there was a sign on the door saying, don't come back till we tell you. Which, you know, if you walked a kilometre from the metro station is kind of annoying. So we actually, in terms of the rhetoric, governments and organisations have failed to actually say their volunteers are important, because they've said to them all, stay home, and we're not, in many cases, we're not going to communicate with you. Then in some cases, we've actually said we urgently or desperately need volunteers for a COVID response. And instead of going to the existing pools of volunteers, we've then recruited for new lots of volunteers. And lots of people, whether they're in New Zealand or the UK, put their hands up and said, I'd love to volunteer. And the systems haven't coped. Mm-hmm. So in the UK, the NHS called for volunteers, the National Health Service. Tens of thousands of people put up their hands and said, I want to volunteer. And many of them were never heard back from that experience. So the one time they actually said, I want to help out and volunteer, they actually had a bad experience with their recruitment, which again shows the lack of importance and value we play in making sure that we get it right the first time. Mm-hmm. And I think COVID will have some long-term implications for volunteering. The result of people being stood down is that people are saying, I'm going to do my own thing anyway. And so people have got together with their neighbours and said, let's set up food pantries, or let's set up book libraries for people who are stuck indoors. Let's work out how we can volunteer to pick up people's groceries and drop them off to shut-in houses. Now, all of that's fantastic. I don't want to stop that mobilising, but it concerns me that the formal sector has been unable to do it in many places.
Right.
And has actually come unstuck. And the other thing that's caused that coming unstuck is organisations have said to their volunteer managers or volunteer coordinators or volunteer leaders, oh, by the way, you're stood down too.
Yeah, or
so
furloughed.
there's been no, so there's been no ability for those organisations to engage with the grassroots community actions that's actually happening around them. And then that turns into, in meetings, I hear this sort of discussion from volunteer managers who are paid, oh, my volunteers are doing
own these
community
humans.
work with someone else.
Yeah.
Which, if anyone has ever said that in front of me, I'm very calm outwardly, but inside my blood is boiling because we never own our volunteers. Our volunteers are lent to us for a period of time to be able to achieve our goals. So long term, the post-COVID thing has implications for volunteering because donations to most not-for-profits will fall across the globe. Mm-hmm. Government funding is being cut right, left and centre to these organisations. So, and because the volunteer manager has often been the first to go, it means that long-term organisations are not thinking about how will we engage with volunteers to deliver our mandate in the future, which begs the question, do we ever think that our volunteers were really that vital to our mission? Mm-hmm. Or in some cases, have we displaced them from the core work so much that they actually have become peripheral, which I think is damaging to the concept of volunteering.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I'm seeing, I think people are alike all over, and there's been an effort with national organizations, the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement, which is a new multi-sector kind of grouping, Points of Light, Volunteer Match, Alive, some funders, other entity leaders, not just in our sector, but we ended up doing a statement from these other giant organizations in our sector, both global and national to North America or USA specifically. We released a statement, I believe in, late April, relatively early on into all of this pandemic crisis, urging executive directors, CEOs, leaders of organizations that work with volunteers to keep their people engaged, even if they shift roles, even if they say we're paused, but keep the communication, keep the engagement, keep the commitment up as much as possible, and that this serves them in the long term. And so there's this signed on by many entities, and then it was copied, I know, in the UK. Rob Jackson and others got in touch with us, like, can we please just copy this language and try to spread it through the UK or in Europe? And the idea is that, you know, we got it to as wide of an audience as we can, but some of the damage was already done. We were already seeing the effects of leaders of these organizations making extremely short-sighted, not at all strategic moves to, again, step down, furlough, lay off volunteers, pause without any communication. And often in my conversations, which mirror yours, colleagues and friends were not in the room when these, as leaders of volunteers or administrators, were not in the room when these decisions were being made. And that gets to some core issues and challenges that Alive, AVM in UK, VMPC in Canada, that professional associations, Points of Light, National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement, that a lot of entities are trying to get to the heart of entity leaders, organizational leadership, understanding how crucial it is to have volunteerism as a core strategy. If you're going to engage with volunteers at all, it really should be woven into the culture and the heart of the mission of the agency, as strategic as development or education or outreach or whatever else departments are doing, operations. It really must be a core part. And the groups that I'm seeing succeed through the tough times, because I also see the patterns you're mentioning of funding cut back from governments, from foundations, from things like that. Some foundations are turning the spigots on more and making it easier to get grants, but that's still too small of a percentage. It's always way too small, and Vu Lee on Twitter's got a great like shame list going of who's not doing it right, so I love to watch his stuff. But what I'm noticing is there's, in San Francisco where I am, there was a great partnership that had never existed before. People have been trying to do this for years, and I was always like, well, no, we can't make that work. But it was the nonprofit Shanti, which does home respite care and a lot of HIV/AIDS, chronic illness support, cancer support, elder care, homebound care, shut-in care. And they finally got the city of San Francisco, which is very slow bureaucracy, to partner. And because kids in public schools here, often the only meal they get, or the only good meal they get, is a school lunch, and that's its own can of worms unravel in our systems. But suddenly kids who couldn't go to school and were trying to Zoom school at home didn't have food. So Shanti and City of San Francisco and a couple of other food pantry charities did partner up and share volunteers, and usually everyone's very, like, again, overly territorial about poaching from each other. And it's been a wonderful success, and it's genuinely reached, a hugely expanded population of people who require these support services who didn't before. And that's the thing, that the social safety net problems are compounded when there's political strife, as we know, when there's polarization, when there is anywhere in the world a government that is bound on authority and austerity as a solution to things, that undermines the funding of the charitable sector that's trying to help it. But it does have that exact same effect that you mentioned of, it absolutely drives up mutual aid and informal volunteering. And
So
go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So I've got a question and a statement. I'm going to run them together.
Sure. Yes.
Let me start with the statement, which is an experience I had of a very large charity, an international charity that operated in multiple countries. And like many older charities, was very old in its systems. And they got a new gung-ho CEO in who decided to modernize the charity. And he decided for some reason that volunteers were part of the old regime. So overnight made a blanket decision to sack all the volunteers, and the volunteer managers, figuring that it would be more efficient to actually get the paid staff to do the work.
Big mistake.
And in some respects, in some locations, he was right. So in terms of the paid staff, were able to focus on their jobs and actually were able to get more done. And other parts, the work just stopped. The biggest impact, which is why I was called in, was reputationally and financially.
Yep.
And we found that 18% of the volunteers sat in the biggest 60% of the donations.
Yep.
So 60% of the organization's donations were coming from 18% of the volunteers.
Yep.
They had sacked those volunteers and their revenue had collapsed.
Yep.
Now, the thing that concerned me, why was there no one in the organization? Now, the only way they found out that data was because I data mined it.
Yeah. Yeah. You had to go looking for it. Yeah.
Correct. So the donation department, the fundraising department, did not know that data. The CEO was never given that data. This is a potential negative impact of you sacking all the volunteers. So to his credit, he then had to write to all the volunteers and ask them back, which was good. But I have been working in this field longer than I want to mention. I've supported the Alives. I've supported the organizations across the world that have been trying to raise the profile of volunteer managers. I've lectured in universities about volunteering management, and I'm not just saying it's about me. That's not the message here. Why have we not shifted in 20 years the perception of the importance and value of volunteering in our community? Now, I have sat through so many volunteer award ceremonies where everyone stands up, puts their hand on their heart and says, we could not do this without volunteering. But the volunteer manager says they actually have to fundraise themselves to be able to afford the pins for the volunteers to get the recognition, which is immediately a disconnect. Why are we still, why have we not progressed?
Do you want my answer, or do you want to?
Yes, please.
You want something else that you want to hear? You may not like my answer.
Because your answer is probably my answer, and I'm looking for something.
We're probably going to validate each other. So from
anyone listening, please feel free to email a new response.
Yes, comment on the video below, comment in the video comments, email us. Yeah.
because I set up the retreat for advanced volunteer management in Australia with Rob Jackson.
Yep.
We ran that in Australia and New Zealand to try and raise, and we had significant impacts from people. And we've done a lot of work, I think, in that space. We've encouraged people to tweet. We've encouraged people to blog, to write. We've encouraged people to stand up for their salaries and negotiation.
Yeah.
Keep going.
No, you're right. And it's frustrating, and I don't think there's one solution, but I think that something that we have figured out recently, and that is something that has led to, although it's not even 3 years old, and it really only launched earlier this year, the creation, at least for the states, because we didn't want to bite off the globe before we could, the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement as a multi-sector and a new approach to having that conversation, and specifically getting outside of our echo chambers. And so there was a recognition in the 2017 MAVA National Summit, after the main summit and workshops of 50 of us in a room, saying, how do we change this conversation, and how do we expand it, and how do we stop talking to the same audience? And it's not fast or overnight. However, even in the last year, again, in focusing on the states, but other people are trying to take the model of the National Alliance and do it in their own areas, because it's doing something different than IAVE. It's really having a different conversation. And the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement is purposefully talking to and seeking out funders and seeking out entity leaders that are not just other volunteer administrators, talking to executive directors, CEOs, development directors, government budget deciders, elected officials, appointed officials, and really listening to why. There's already some good data, MAVA has some good data, but really listening to them of like, why is there this disconnect between what you say on Volunteer Appreciation Day and the policies that occur from the top down? And without, shaming anyone of like, gosh, I guess you've learned your lesson about laying off the volunteers in the last few months, like without bringing up that wound, but really just saying, as a funder, what do you need to hear from an executive director to specifically fund volunteer engagement and volunteer programs more than you are now? And as an executive director, CEO, executive director, CEOs, what do you need to hear either from funders or from board members or from other entity leaders, who are not just your staff of leaders of volunteers in your organization? Like, what convinces you of that? And what we've heard so far from these, just beginning these conversations, and more research is to be done, is we're in this terrible catch-22 where funders say, well, no CEOs are telling me that they value volunteer engagement, so unless we hear that they want it, why should we give them money about it? And the CEOs are like, well, no funders ever said they're demanding volunteer engagement in my budget of priority programs, so I'm just going to go where I have to chase the money. Whatever they say the money gets spent on is what it gets spent on. And so it's this feedback loop. And a few very brave progressive funders and executive directors or CEOs have broken the cycle. And what we're aiming to do with the Alliance working groups is bust open these conversations and cross-pollinate the conversations, not just in our sector, but throughout HR conferences, faith convenings and conferences, government disaster relief conferences. So not just Points of Light is awesome, Points of Light is great, we know that. And what other conferences and convenings and panels and white papers and studies are occurring, including even out to IAVE, that can expand and amplify the conversation that this is, and also show that return on investment data. So, Dr. Sue Carter-Cole is Dr. Sue in San Diego. She's done a lot of great research. Arnova's done a lot of great research. Points of Light has the Generosity Commission, which has funded and collected a lot of great research. So, like you said, it's how do we get that data to the person that needs to see it and hear it? and how do they know to ask for things like that? And that is hopefully something that we can shift because of this crisis. And if there's a silver lining to any of the horribleness that is occurring right now, I think it is that people are forced to do things differently. And in being forced to do things differently, are listening to more ideas, including this one of maybe don't put a big black banner across your hospital website saying we are not accepting volunteers, no way, no how. Which I've also seen with clients of like, maybe not do that. Say, our volunteer roles have shifted, ask us how, or
Yes,
something that's a little bit
perfect,
more welcoming. And
perfect.
so I'm hoping that that's where we go with this. Uh, to the political polarization, it's really fascinating because, again, at least in the States and a little bit worldwide, but we have the Points of Light Foundation, which was founded originally by the Bush family, but heavily supported by the Clinton Foundation. And so that served as a bipartisan model and a somewhat centrist model. And centrism has its place, and maybe right now isn't the time for centrism, but for incremental change. But at least it was a great model of um, volunteering can be neutral ground. Volunteering doesn't have to have a political agenda, it just should have a community benefit agenda, a community impact agenda. And you and I have also had conversations, and I know I've had this conversation with Rob, and you've had this conversation with Rob about, there are definitely ways for volunteering to be evil and bad and wrong. And there are places around the world where volunteering is seen as a heavily political, if not insurgent, activity, or is seen as absolutely not connect. Community networks or community aid is never connected to the government because the government will grab you off the street and cannot be trusted. So I'm specifically thinking of South America and how volunteer
Yes.
relates down there. So do we see a way out of this other than something like the National Alliance and trying to have these conversations? Do you see a way to connect people again in a common goal, even if it seems like, because this isn't always the case, there's definitely extremists, but I think almost everybody is not, you know, at these very, very polar ends. We just get fed this on social media and in other ways for ratings and clicks. How do you see a solution coming out of this conundrum? No pressure.
This is where the magic of volunteering happens for me. That when you actually get a group of people working together, the natural conversations can be phenomenally life-changing. And sometimes in our volunteer recruitment, we have made it impossible for diverse people to get in. And by diverse people, it could be, we've set our program up so wealthy people don't feel comfortable here. Or it could be that Asian people don't feel comfortable here.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a famous story that I tell of one organization I was the new volunteer coordinator in, where one of the people, actually older women who'd been operating there for 30, 40 years as a volunteer, came up to me and said, "We hope you don't do what the previous volunteer coordinator tried to do." And I said, "Oh, what's that? You're enthusiastic on your first day."
Right.
She said she tried to bring those Asian types in, and we know they don't fit in here.
That's a very
So
Prince Philip quote. That's a very, very Prince Philip quote.
So what did Martin do? He made sure he recruited heavily international students,
Yep.
but he put them on any day that she was not there.
Yeah. I mean, you were tactical about it, but you're like tactical rebellion. And that's the thing.
But we
Yeah.
as organizations, now there are some organizations, for example, if you're the young Republicans, you're not going to encourage diverse Democrats to join your organization unless you're trying to convert them.
Right.
Likewise, many religious organizations, it's appropriate for a person sharing that faith to join that organization.
Right.
But if you're a secular general organization, we need to find ways that encourage the conversations internally and encourage the difficult conversations internally. And we are going to get people with diverse political, diverse religious, diverse personal views, because that's who we are. And we've become so used to reacting. I actually think, and one of the things that we did in my orientation courses is we actually had a session where we encouraged people to think about how do we listen to each other. Now, we did it ostensibly, but how do we listen to our clients?
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is we were trying to say to the paid staff, how do you listen to diverse volunteers?
Right.
And we're trying to say to the volunteers, how do you listen to each other? Which means I could then have the wealthy upper class women who came to give their half a morning a week with a coffee break at the end, with my working class rough and ready group. I'm trying not to stereotype here, but
Yeah.
I was actually
Yeah.
seeing these things in action,
Mm-hmm.
where these people were sitting down together to have coffee together in the coffee break and quietly helping each other in that room. And no fuss about it, but just, there was a bit of money exchanged sometimes, or a bit of advice exchanged times. One woman came out to me one day and she said, I had no idea what the people in my city were actually going through till I had the conversations today. So trying to build that diversity in my recruitment, trying to create volunteer spaces where anyone could drop in and volunteer in a safe environment was really important to me. And I think we need to try and set up programs where there will be some things where we need specific skills, but there'll be other ones where we can actually get people mixing together.
And I think that's ideal, because something else we've agreed on in our world travels is people are people everywhere. People have the same core worries, loves. People want friends, family, to relax, to enjoy their home, enjoy nature, to feel safe, like well beyond, Maslow's set of hierarchies, or it doesn't have to be that complicated. It's just people are people. I've worked in I have a background in ecological conservation, and I've worked in, quite literally, Soviet Russia in 1990 at the fall of the Soviet system. And the folks I was working with, certain topics we wouldn't get into, certain political topics we wouldn't get into, but because we were united in, cleaning out a wetland system, cleaning up a stream, cleaning out natural areas, eating together, working together, that's where you find that common humanity and that empathy. And what I'm seeing in the rise of mutual aid is that, particularly in a crisis, nature abhors a vacuum, so ecosystem's going to create what it needs to create in any case. Is people are like, the government services aren't coming to my area, or the volunteer opportunities for that nonprofit, like you're right, there's a barrier for me in money. There's usually an economic barrier, because I can't afford to get there, I can't afford to pay to park, I can't afford the uniform, whatever the case may be. There's usually a time, transportation, economic barrier to people volunteering, so that I've done as best I could. Sometimes I'm with open space agencies where there's absolutely no way to get out there on public transit. And we've worked out, like, oh, can the agency rent buses for large drop-in activities that go to these community centers deep in urban neighborhoods in San Jose or San Francisco, to help people at least get transported to have this opportunity together. And some of the agencies I've worked with have done very specific community research and town hall discussions and focus groups and surveys in different languages, and gotten genuinely surprising answers that were extremely useful data on why people didn't volunteer, or why they didn't use open space, or why they didn't feel comfortable coming to a park and having a barbecue for a birthday party, like someone from a different cultural background might. And there's been this thing in volunteerism that's been a similar problem in conservation in the States, which is this very narrow, white, colonial, middle class experience, means that that's the experience that you must project onto everybody else. And those are the assumed answers as to why something is or isn't happening or working, that you project onto somebody else. And when my previous agency did a study in 2014 and published it after a couple of years. And they just did a part two. And I'll put those links in there if people want to find out, called Understanding Our Community. There is a incredible individual and cultural range for why someone does or does not trust being outside or feel safe in nature, does or does not, how they define volunteering or giving to their community. It may be something that they just do with their faith group or with their family group, versus being with strangers. And some people only want to be with strangers. So until you are curious and ask and listen, like you talked about training people to listen to each other, you don't have enough information to form the activities that are going to work for people. And if you must function without information, then at least create a very, like you said, general umbrella, warm, welcoming, as unbiased as we can possibly make it in language or cultural norms, uh, and see who turns up and drops into it. But if you're talking to people who are middle class and white and only speak English, and it costs $100 to be a docent at the zoo because of the training and the uniform, you're only going to get a certain population of, elderly, retired, wealthy people.
Yep,
Like you said,
absolutely.
the stereotype.
Yes.
And particularly if there's, if something's happening during working hours, if we're in a world where we're not working at home and we're in a normal employment cycle, uh, having opportunities that are different than work and school hours is a huge part of it, or being able to do something at home and remote. So hopefully this pattern of working at from home, doing a lot of volunteering at home projects virtually, remotely, online, hopefully this pattern stays in place because it offers a wider accessibility, uh,
Yes.
to more people than having to physically turn up in a place. It's genuinely transformational experience. And the best way to build empathy and understanding and get outside of the social media echo chambers and the bubbles and the things in life that are pushing us further apart, or the shouting and the yelling that's pushing us further apart in certain beliefs, political or personal beliefs. It really gets down to somebody typically has, a narrow-minded or ignorant or even hostile view of something when they've had no direct experience with someone in that circumstance. And whether it's trans, homeless, um, differently abled, neurodiverse, if even in certain areas of the world, different colors of people, different backgrounds of people, and different age groups. There's the classic joke of millennials versus boomers, and our generation Gen X in the middle, just eating popcorn and watching them fight each other. But my experience is that that's, it's a joke and it's a meme, but that's not reality when people are chopping onions together, chopping vegetables together, um, cuddling puppies together to, or kittens to socialize them, or pulling out, broom and weeds along a trail in a public park together. That's having that common experience, and often even overcoming something challenging. Like the volunteer task itself could be considered a chore, if it's something you do in your own life, but because it's having an impact on the greater community, and you're doing an act of service, and an act of love and generosity, that I think automatically really, helps people break down their own walls and experience and realize, like, oh, I guess I have, a woman who's talking about her wife working right next to me or supervising this volunteer crew, and I haven't had this conversation before, and it's unfamiliar, but I'm going to, by the end of the day, it's not going to be uncomfortable. And so I think that empathy and rediscovering each other's humanity in helping our communities is the key. And I also think that's literally the only way we're going to survive as species and as
Yes.
societies. As
Yes.
so, I'm advising, clients who are organizations, like if you're, like you're talking about my volunteers and kind of circling, ending with circling back to that idea, or reincorporating that idea, that the more we understand that we're sharing talent pools with each other, or to tap into the energy of a mutual aid network and not try to control it, not have it fit into your thing. But how can you partner if you notice that there's pop-up food pantries and now your organization is able to get your volunteers back to your food bank and start to
Yes.
serve that area again? Partner with them. Doesn't mean they have to
Yes.
officially sign up to volunteer with you, but at least partner in distribution. And I think part of letting go of these old systems that don't work for us anymore as leaders of volunteers and as leaders of these agencies is what volunteering looks like. It can look like so many things aside from the traditional roles done by retired people or college kids just needing units that we've seen in the last 20 years. So hopefully that's part of the change
Let me
that
give you an example from Thailand of successful collaboration.
please, yeah.
And I'll start with a story of unsuccessful. So Thailand had about 60-day severe lockdown, no leaving homes, businesses shuttered, parks shuttered, everything shut down. Significant amount of the GDP in Thailand comes from tourism, no tourists. So if you're at the bottom, almost no social safety net, you're on a daily wage system, or you're selling stuff by where the tour buses get out. You know, you're the courier drivers. You know, well, not even the courier drivers. You're at the bottom rung. And there's a chunk of Thai population that are in that situation. So a group of middle-class Thais, and I'm not being critical, please don't hear that from Thai people, I'm not an outsider being critical, decided that they would help. So they organized food and money, which is great, and set up tables outside the central railway station downtown to give out the food. The line for the food stretched for a couple of kilometers. There was no security, no police, just a group of nice people setting up tables. They ran out of food.
Of course, yeah.
People had been lined up for hours and hadn't eaten for days. There was a riot. The police were called. The organizers of this event were arrested.
Oh, goodness. Oh, my goodness.
You know, because it was a complete shambles. One of the success stories of the Thailand coronavirus response, there are many, Thailand's done a very good job, was what they call the village health volunteers. So every urban community and every village has health volunteers. And they went house to house through the crisis, checking people's temperatures, checking if people were sick, if they were ill, getting them tested, taking them to hospital. So people couldn't hide at home sick. So this has been a very, very successful program across the whole country and has been one of the keys to ensuring that track and trace happened, that people were immediately isolated. So one of the successful projects was a coalition of groups, informal and formal, joined together to form a COVID aid response. And they went to each village volunteer and said, what sort of food does your village need? And if we deliver it to you, can you get it to the people who actually need it? Because not every home in that village needed food, but some desperately did. So what happened was the volunteers, instead of just dumping food on tables at the front, then dropped the food parcels at the homes of the people who were shut in, who actually needed it. And it meant that conversations could happen along the lines of, please don't drop any fish off to our village because we're a fishing village. We don't need fish, but we need noodles and we need rice. So the volunteers could then go and fundraise for noodles and rice for that village. Likewise, the villages that were mostly Muslim or entirely Muslim didn't get non-halal products to that village. And so it meant that the response was targeted because they used the existing village volunteer health network. And it meant that people could actually get the food that they needed. So there is room for this partnership between spontaneous and organized volunteering. And the final point I want to make on this is, I hope I haven't sounded like a pessimist, because I actually have seen we are miles ahead than what we were 20 years ago. We actually have good data. we actually have things like the CVA has raised the profile of what do we need in a volunteer management. When we talk about impact and data of volunteering, people's eyes don't glaze over. They actually get engaged with the conversation. I actually see CEOs who can say to me, yes, our volunteers contributed 22% of our financial resources last year, and they did the following 3 things in our community, and we measure those things. So we actually have moved ahead. So it's not all gloom and doom and pessimism, but we have to be vigilant in this time of people shutting down their programs and laying off their volunteer managers to say, we're not going to walk away from this space. We're going to keep ensuring that volunteers and volunteer management owns the center of the village, isn't outside the village.
Absolutely. And it's ongoing, and as much as people are under so much more stress than usual, or often than they've been in before, and new populations of people are stressed, displaced, and I'm speaking from, California is a place of extreme privilege and extreme income inequality. We have millionaires right next to people whose houses have just burned down, and maybe they were middle class, but now their house is burned down. So it's fascinating to get these perspectives from you in your travels, and specifically that great example from Thailand of what works and what doesn't. And I think we're seeing more and more models that work, and more people and organizations are open to copying that and open to sharing information. So I think another advantage of the last 20 years in this sector is not just the technological advances, but the attitude and paradigm shift around starting to have conversations not just with our same groups of people, seeing leadership in organizations of professional associations of not just the same people over and over again, and that a real attempt to get a diversity of voices, a genuine diversity of voices, away from the usual demographics of our sector, of the leaders in our sector, and to take that to heart, and to see these examples of success and not be so territorial.
Yes, which I guess is going to be my final priceless advice.
Yes.
Is ask for help.
Yeah.
Too many managers of volunteers, particularly in these times, can flounder. And the reality is that there are people out there who won't judge you. Well, we might have a laugh with you, but we won't judge you. And we can actually get things fixed really quickly. And it's extraordinary how many things people have actually gone through. And you and I know people who can connect people immediately. So if somebody came to us and said, I've done this terrible thing, we can go, actually, it's not that terrible. 6 other people did it in Canada. Let's introduce them to you. Or we know someone in New Zealand who's done exactly the same thing as you, and this is how they fixed it. So I encourage, if you're feeling isolated and despairing, you're not. Reach out.
We have a whole peer network of support for each other. Now that more of us are communicating online, I'm seeing, not just because of my nice little web series on YouTube, but I'm seeing much more global conversation than I think we had when we were flying to see each other. So
correct.
I'll take it. And Martin, I deeply appreciate your priceless advice and your Tuesday tips, golden wisdom pieces floated in there as well. And it looks like it's a gorgeous day in Bangkok. It looks pretty
always amazing. Is.
Not hardly a bad day out there. And I wish you really, really well and continued health and safety. And I'm really excited to share your priceless advice with everyone who tunes in.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'd like to wish everybody the greeting that Thais would give each other in this situation. Chok dik rap. Good luck.